Good morning, children. How are you feeling? Children, today I'm going to teach you the new chapter and its name is White Mice. Children, I would first do a model reading for you. Few lines you repeat after me and then I shall proceed with the explanation. Is that all right? White Mice. Mr. Ghosh's house was just behind the station. He brought me a cup of sweet milky tea and 2 large rasgullas. Now, let me show you my family, he said, and he took me by the hand and led me to a veranda at the back of the house. This is the way you shall read with proper punctuation marks. Where we are supposed to stop, when there is a small comma, we need to pause for a while. My dear children, now what I want to tell you is about this particular chapter. This chapter has been narrated by Ruskin Bond as a child. He tells us in this chapter about his uncle who puts him in the wrong train and how he reaches to Lucknow. He gets down in Lucknow and sends a telegram to his grandfather where he comes to pick him up. Now when he gets down in Lucknow, what happens is a very kind station master by the name of Mr. Ghosh holds him and shows all this generosity and kindness to him and takes him to his house. And now you see what happens. It so happens that Mr. Ghosh, when he takes him to his house, and after taking him to his house, he takes him to the back courtyard of his house, and look what he sees there, what Ruskin sees there. He sees white mice. He sees some white mice. Not only that, he sees white mice, and beside those white mice, he sees a Ferris wheel. Ferris wheel, what we see in the fair these days when you go to, you perhaps might have gone to see Disneyland, where you see that giant wheel, you know, like this sort of wheel, and children swinging, and there are swings, these kind of things. Children are swinging in these kind of, this is known as giant wheel. So what he sees there, and he gets so excited, and by the time after he sees all this, he feeds those small white mice with biscuits, and then he falls asleep on a huge armchair. And now, my dear children, after falling on the armchair, he goes off to sleep. What happens is his grandfather comes and almost wakes him up. And the same night, what happens is he travels with his grandfather to Dehradun. He gets down at Dehradun, and remember, children, I am just briefing you the explanation, just briefing you out. So he gets down there and he goes to his grandfather's place, and where he sees Uncle Ken again there. And what he does, he was thinking of taking a small little revenge from his uncle. So what he does is he puts those white mice in the bed sheet, in Uncle Ken's bed sheet. And you know what happens? Those small white mice, it crisscrops all over his body, and out of fright he jumps out, and he jumps with fear, and almost he wants to pull out his clothes, and all this has been planned. After that, the entire night he sleeps on an old sofa. This is what happens. And then when he leaves for Delhi, but remember, this time it's grandfather who puts him to the right train to go to Delhi. And then grandfather tells him that he would take care of those white mice. after that, what happens? Grandfather falls in love with those white mice and he wanted to have some more of them. So he writes a letter to Mr. Ghosh, the station master, to send him some more. But unfortunately, my dear children, he goes on a transfer. Children, in page number 5, we have a few words which are already given in the book as word meanings. But my dear children, apart from that, I thought there are some more words which are to be pinpointed, and they are tunnel. Then they are, once again, let me just tell you, it's rattling. These are the word meanings which I want to tell you, given in page number 5. And some more. Tunnel is a artificial passage, and rattling is it's the meaning of rattling is sound which is a long knocking sound. And my dear children, out of this, when you move to page number 6, you have some more words. They are pleasure, screaming, compartment, and in page number 7, the last page, beneath, transferred, etc. Although a few words are already given in the word meaning box, but what I want to tell you is we need to put stress upon these words too, so that we all learn to make sentences out of it. Like, supposing I would like to make a sentence. Make a sentence. Make sentences. I would like to make a sentence with beneath. Beneath means underneath. The cat is sitting beneath the sofa, right? Children, please repeat these word meanings which are given up here on the door. Tunnel, rattling, in the same way. We have compartment, and then we have pleasure, screaming, etc. And then we need to make sentences, and the one which I made over here is out of beneath. The cat is sitting beneath the sofa. Now, my dear children, we have I already explained to you about this chapter, but there would be a few slides which will be followed, and you can do your work out of it. Those slides will be a help for you, not only for explanation, rather for your notes, etc. So, my dear children, have a nice day.
Good morning, children. How are you feeling today? Now, children, before I start the new chapter in English literature, let me tell you and ask you a few things. Do you like pets? Or have you seen your family members pampering and loving pets? Or some of them might be afraid of pets. And at times you might like their reactions. If they are afraid, they'll run for their lives, isn't it? So let me tell you the name of the chapter which I am going to read out to you and also explain to you. The name of the chapter is White Mice. It's a story related by one of our famous authors, that is Ruskin Bond. And let me give you an introduction about the great author Ruskin Bond. He loves children and animals, and he loves writing for them. Now he stays in Missouri. White Mice. The story is narrated by a little boy. He was to return to his parents after his summer vacations. His uncle, Ken, who comes to the station to see him off, puts him on the wrong train. When the boy realizes the mistake his uncle made, he gets down at Lucknow and sends a telegram to his grandfather. The kind station master, Mr. Ghosh, keeps the boy safe till his grandfather reaches Lucknow and invites him to his house. Now, children, I am going to read out the first page of the chapter, page 5, as model reading, and after that, I am going to ask you questions. So, please listen carefully as I read. It is also a model reading for you. And here I begin. Mr. Ghosh's house was just behind the station. He brought me a cup of sweet, milky tea and two large rasgullas. Now, let me show you my family, he said. He took me by the hand and led me to a veranda at the back of the house. There was a miniature railway complete with a station, railway bungalows, signal boxes, and next to it, a miniature fairground complete with swings, a roundabout, and a Ferris wheel. 15 to 20 mice were dancing on the roundabout and Ferris wheel. Another dozen or so ran in and out of tunnels and climbed up on a toy train. Mr. Kosh pressed a button and the little train, crowded with white mice, left the station and went rattling off to the far corner of the veranda. And the explanation goes like this. When Ruskin Bond was a little boy, his uncle Ken takes him to the station to see him off, to put him in a train which goes to Delhi. But by mistake, he puts him in a different train. When Ruskin realizes this, he gets down at Lucknow and sends a telegram to his grandfather. Meanwhile, a very generous and kind station master, Mr. Ghosh, keeps him very safe with him. And then Mr. Ghosh takes him to his house. And his house was just behind the station. He brings him a cup of sweet milky tea and two large rasgullas. My dear children, you might have heard about the sweet rasgullas. They are famous in West Bengal. And now Mr. Ghosh tells Ruskin and shows him to his family. He takes him by his hand and takes him to the veranda at the back of the house. where Ruskin gets a shock to see a miniature railway with a complete station, many bungalows, single boxes, and a giant wheel just beside the miniature railway tracks, and a roundabout Ferris wheel is here talked about what we see in a fair. Children, do you visit a fair very often? I'm sure you might like to go to visit a fair too. In Bokaro, you might have visited the Disneyland and many more different fairs which we find to see during Dashara and Deepavali. Here, all this is put up as a model for those white mice. For those white mice, so that they enjoy a life, a exactly a natural life. And then guess what Ruskin sees? He sees a dozen of so many white mice, and they are seen running in and out of tunnels, climbing the toy train. And then what Ruskin sees here is that Mr. Ghosh tries to press a button, and the little train with the white mice leaves the station and goes rattling off to the far off to the veranda. Now, children, answer a few questions. Just make an attempt to answer if you have really understood the lesson. Who is the narrator of the story? Yes, it is Ruskin Bond. Who puts the boy in the train? Uncle Ken puts the boy in the train, isn't it? What is the mistake? Yes, the mistake is that Uncle puts him in the wrong train. What does the boy do once he realizes his uncle's mistake? Yes, the boy gets down at Lucknow and then sends a telegram to his grandfather. Who is Mr. Ghosh? Yes, Mr. Ghosh is the station master. What was the boy offered to eat at Mr. Ghosh's house? Yes, of course, rasagullas and a sweet cup of milky tea. What kind of a man was Mr. Ghosh? Mr. Ghosh was a kind man. How does the boy inform his grandfather about what happened? The boy informs his grandfather through a telegram. Children, can you tell me what are the new words you have come across in this page? Yes, they are Lucknow, Rasagullas, Dehra, Delhi, and so on. And now let me continue with the reading exercise which is given in page number 6. Now children, listen carefully. This is a model reading, right? It was all so impressive. By the time grandfather arrived, I had fed biscuits to the mice and fallen asleep in a huge armchair in Mr. Ghosh's living room. I woke up to find the station master busy showing grandfather his little railway colony of white mice. Grandfather was interested in the toy train, but he said polite things about the mice, commenting their pink eyes and pretty lithe feet. Mr. Ghosh beamed with pleasure and sent out for more rasgullas. When grandfather and I had settled into the compartment of a train late that night, Mr. Ghosh came to the window to say goodbye. As the train began moving, he thrust a cardboard box into my hands and said, "A present for you and your grandfather." More rasgullas, I thought. Later, when the train was underway and I lifted the lid of the box, I found two white mice asleep on a bed of cotton wool. Back in Dehra, I kept the white mice in their box. I had plans for them. After dinner, I slipped into my uncle's room and released the white mice under his bed sheet. An hour later, we all had to leap out of our beds when Uncle Ken dashed out of his room, screaming that something soft and furry was running about inside his clothes. "Well, off with the clothes," said grandfather, giving me a wink. He had a good idea of what had happened. And here is my explanation to page number 6. By the time when grandfather had arrived to take Ruskin, he had already fed the biscuits and had fallen asleep on a huge armchair of Mr. Ghosh's living room. And when he woke up, he was seen he was watching grandfather and Mr. Ghosh very busy monitoring the white mice. And grandfather was so interested in the toy train that he spoke such praiseworthy words for the mice. As he said, the the eyes were very beautiful and pink, and their feet were very thin and graceful. And Mr. Ghosh was so very happy to listen to such praises by grandfather. He asked for more rasgullas to be brought. And then, when the night arrived, grandfather and Ruskin boarded the train to go to Dehra. There he finds that Mr. Ghosh comes with a small little cardboard box, and he gives it to Ruskin, and he tells, "A present for you and for your grandfather." Mr. Ghosh tells Ruskin and his grandfather that there is a small little present, a gift for you. And to his delight, Ruskin thinks it might be some more rasagullas. But then, slowly, when he lifts the lid of the box, he finds two beautiful white mice on a cotton bed. And when they reach, both of them, when they reach Dehradun, he keeps the white mice in the box and then he starts planning. Ruskin is busy planning, after dinner, he slipped his he slipped to the bed with his uncle. And as he slipped to the bed with his uncle, what he does was, is he takes those tiny white mice and releases them under Uncle Ken's bed sheet. Oh my God! And after an hour, those little white mice, they start leaping out of the bed, and Uncle Ken screaming, shouting, and was running around, almost about to open his clothes, and all those things. He gets so frightened, and then grandfather tells him, take off your clothes. And by the time, as grandfather tells uncle to take off his clothes, he winks his eye very much and says, what a good idea. Whatever happened, just to teach Uncle Ken a lesson. He wanted to teach Uncle Ken a lesson, because he Uncle Ken had already put him in the wrong train, and he wanted his scatterbrained brained uncle a lesson, just because he had those gifts from his new friend, the station master, and those yummy rasgullas, and those white, beautiful pair of white mice. And now, my dear children, I have a few questions for you. What was the boy doing when his grandfather arrived? Obviously, he was feeding the white mice and had fallen asleep in a huge armchair. Why did Mr. Ghosh beam with pleasure? Yes, because his little pets were being complimented by Ruskin's grandfather. What was the gift to the boy from Mr. Ghosh? Was a The gift was a box with two white mice. What was the boy's plan for the mice? To frighten his Uncle Ken. Why and how did Uncle Ken react to the mice? In his bed, he jumped, he started running, he screamed, dashed out of his room, and as he was walking around all over, running about inside his room, and trying to take out his clothes almost. And here I am to continue with the reading exercise of page number 7. After Uncle Ken had done a tap dance, one white mouse finally came out from the clothes, but the other had run up the sleeve of his pyjama coat and suddenly popped out beneath his chin. Uncle Ken started to panic. Convinced that his room was full of mice, pink, white, and brown, he locked himself in the storeroom and slept on an old sofa. Next day, grandfather took me to the station and put me on the train to Delhi. It was the right train this time. I look after the white mice, he said. Grandfather grew quite fond of the mice and even wrote to Mr. Ghosh asking if he could spare another pair. But Mr. Ghosh, he learned later, had been transferred to another part of the country and had taken his family of white mice with him. To continue with the explanation part of page number 7. Now that Uncle Ken was very busy doing the tap dance, rhythmical tapping of his toes and trying to take out those creepy things which went inside his sleeves and the pajama coat. And then what he sees was one white mouse comes out of his clothes and the other one almost popping out of his chin. Uncle Ken became more frightened and he was very sure that the room is full of pink, white and brown mice. And so he locked himself in the storeroom of his house and slept on an old sofa. Next day, as grandfather knew that I had to go home to Delhi and from there onwards, so he put me this time on the right train. And then he told me, my dear grandchild, I am going to take care of the white mice. And as grandfather was very fond of mice, he writes a letter to Mr. Ghosh to if he could spare another pair of white mice. But this time, Mr. Ghosh had been transferred to another part of the country and had already taken the entire white mice family along with him. Where did Uncle Ken spend the rest of the night? Uncle Ken spent the rest of his night on the old sofa. What did grandfather write to Mr. Ghosh? Grandfather wrote to Mr. Ghosh asking for another pair of white mice. Did grandfather get another pair? No, grandfather did not get another pair. And children, to continue with the questionnaire, may I ask you some more questions? Who took care of the mice when the boy left for Delhi? Yes, of course, it was grandfather who took care of the white mice. Why could grandfather not get any more mice from Mr. Ghosh? Yes, because Mr. Ghosh had been transferred to another part of the country and taken his family of white mice along with him. Now tell me, children, who is the forgetful character in the story? Uncle Ken is the most forgetful character in the story. Where did the narrator get down? The narrator got down in Lucknow. Some of the new words which we are coming across in page number 6 and 7 are colony, commending, lead, beamed, thrust, released, dashed, wink, tap dance, popped out, convinced, etc.